Well, good afternoon if you are in Cleveland or Ashland, Ohio, or Charlottesville, Virginia, or New York City, where I am, or if you are listening in Los Angeles, where Grammy Awards are handed out, or if you're listening any place in the world, and especially our loved ones in Ukraine, we are there for you. We stand with you. It's Friday. And I'm Fred Plotkin, and that makes us Fred Plotkin on Fridays. Welcome. It's on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all around the world. I'm holding in my hand a Grammy Award-winning recording. This is the Oscar of the recorded music world, and we tend to think of the Beyoncés and the Lizzos and so on, and they're great, they're terrific, but we people in classical music and opera get Grammys too, at least the very talented good ones do. And I'm very honored to have as my guest today two of the protagonists on this album, which is the New York Youth Symphony Orchestra, playing music by distinguished women African-American composers. And the conductor is Michael Repper, who joins us today from Virginia. And the legendary, I'm told, because she is, I don't have to be told that, but enough people tell me that, oh, Judith Sherman is legendary. That, Judith, do you mind having that attached to your name? Legendary, okay?
Yeah, I'm getting used to it.
Am I correct? You've won 14.
Old, actually.
You've won 14 or 15 Grammys.
15.
So George Schulte, Beyonce Knowles, and Judith Sherman.
Yeah.
Schulte had 31 or 32 of them.
Yeah. And you know, the three of you, maybe John Williams, I haven't checked. But the point is, when I was watching the Grammy Awards back in February of this year, they sadly don't have on the program the classical music people. They should. Basically, the program has become very skewed to a narrow segment of what we call music. And I would love for the Grammy Awards to represent music in its fullest, and that includes what we call classical music. And in this particular case, African-American women composers. Very important. I have to
say that they used to.
They did used to, I remember.
Always a classical music performance on the Grammys.
I remember that, but it's really, they're not doing that anymore, and that's their fault, not our fault. But among the many things that were particular, I don't believe in competition, but you beat out the Los Angeles Philharmonic and Gustavo Dudamel and the Berlin Philharmonic. And Michael and Judy, were you shocked?
Well, yeah, I was on my way to Martha's Vineyard that day because my mother-in-law was turning 100 the next day. And therefore I couldn't be at the Grammys. And I was also in a hotel where the Wi-Fi wasn't working terribly well because of ice storms. So the first thing I knew was my assistant texted me and said, NYYS won, and, you know, balloons and confetti and whatever you can put on a text. So that was then, you know, then I was happy enough to. And then when I found out that I had also won as producer of the year, that was really quite an amazing evening for me. It
was a really great
Michael,
spirited 20 minutes.
Michael, you're from Southern California. Were you in Southern California when the announcement came?
Yes, I was at the ceremony and was thrilled to be home. It was great, actually. I was able to see my family in the days preceding. And I was at the ceremony because, as you mentioned, the classical awards aren't given at the main televised ceremony in the evening. But there is what they call the premiere ceremony just beforehand. And it's where about actually 90% of the awards are given. And so I was very honored to be there along with a team from New York Youth Symphony and from our label, Avi. and to give the acceptance speech as well, and to formally accept the award on behalf of everybody, on behalf of Judith, on behalf of the young musicians especially, and the composers and Michelle Cam. So it was a thrilling experience to be at the Grammys, of course.
And who did you meet? This is the red carpet side of the story, the champagne carpet. Who did you meet in the music world that night that you never thought you'd meet?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, there's so many people who, just like we were talking about before we started this interview, that it's surprising that you, Fred, and Judith have not actually met in person, even though, and that's just so funny how that works in the music industry sometimes. There are some people who I've always really looked up to that I've met for the first time, even though, we've sort of been tangentially, working on the same sorts of things. Curtis Stewart is one person who I really respect and look up to a lot, and certainly in the classical music field, he now runs American Composers Orchestra, and I've looked up to him for a long time, and really had a great chat with several of series of great chats with him throughout the ceremony. But we also, sat not 10 feet from Viola Davis. I know we're outside classical music now.
No, we don't have to stay. Good music is good music. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So Viola Davis won a Grammy, and we didn't know it, but we were sitting about 10 feet from her, and she stood up and got on stage and said, "I just got my EGOT," and that was an amazing experience to see. I
think there are 18 of them. EGOT is Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, Tony, the 4 big entertainment awards. And I'll bet you'll get a K for Kennedy Center one day. So
one day,
yeah.
One day. So it was thrilling. It was a lot of fun. I've been a member of the Academy for several years, a couple of years, and but this is the first time I've ever been. And it was a huge honor. And you asked whether we were shocked. I mean, yeah, I think you're always shocked if you're going to win a Grammy Award. It's thrilling. I guess we were simultaneously shocked and surprised. But in many ways, I also, I really believe in the power of young people, and in many ways, that's what makes this project special. And so, in some ways, I'm not shocked because, when young people really have an opportunity to put something special together, and when they have a good team behind them,
well,
in
that's
many
where
ways,
I wanted to go in our conversation. Before we talk about the making of the recording, I'd like to have you tell about the history of the New York Youth Symphony, which I know goes back to 1963.
That's right.
I remember it when I was a kid, hearing them perform. So talk about this ensemble.
Sure. Well, New York Youth Symphony is one of the most special, ensembles of young people anywhere in the world. And as you mentioned, it's in its 60th year. We're in our 60th season. And it's not just a symphony. The symphony itself takes in students between age 12 and 22. And they don't just come from New York. They come, in fact, from all over the country, even the world, because there are members of the orchestra who are in their upper teenage years or in college. You have a lot of students who are at Juilliard or MSM, NYU,
School
Columbia.
Of Music, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And so it's a great collection of students who come from all over to make this ensemble, and they're an incredibly special group of musicians. The organization is beyond just the symphony. It also has a jazz band, a composition department. I have my own conducting studio as part of the New York Youth Symphony program. There's musical theater songwriting and chamber music even. So there's all kinds of wonderful programs that New York Youth Symphony does. And one of the most special things, and this kind of leads into the album itself, that I think New York Youth Symphony does and has done for over 30 years, is that at every single concert of the orchestra, going back, like I said, over 3 decades, the orchestra has commissioned and performed a world premiere work by a young composer. And that's staggering. That's a really tremendous commitment to new music. And it's because our young musicians have that that knowledge of working with new music that it was so, I don't want to say easy, but it was very germane for them to step into this world of recording music that hadn't been recorded before, without the opportunity to have listened to music before. And so that's the history of the program and sort of what set up the institution to be well prepared to do a project like this.
So when a musician turns 22, does he or she out, or what happens?
I'm sorry, you cut out
In
there.
other words,
I think you said that when they turn
when the
22.
musician hits 22 years old, do they have to go, or can they
Yes.
stay on? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, yeah, it is a youth orchestra after all, and you know that what we want to do is we want to provide opportunities to as many people as we can, right? And so many of our musicians are working professionally in orchestras and winning jobs, and people are doing that as young as 22 now. It happens, and so I take great pride in following where our students go, and keeping in touch with them personally beyond when they're 22. And even if they are in the program until they're 18, and then maybe they go to college somewhere else in the country or even the world. And so they might leave for that reason. But I take my role as a mentor to them very, very seriously. And so, no matter where they are, I'll always follow them for sure.
You're not that much older.
I'm 32. It is funny that that this is my 6th year with the group. And so when I joined, I actually was 26. I might have even been 25, depending on I would have been 25. And the oldest, in the groups were 22. And I remember that first rehearsal, they're calling me maestro, and I was like, oh my gosh, we're the same age. Yeah, I really like trying to relate to them, and I take my role as a mentor to them very, very, very seriously.
So before we get into the album, I do know that at the age of 32, you are the youngest American conductor ever to win a Grammy Award. The only one who was younger was Gustavo Dudamel, Venezuelan, who won at the age of 31.
That's right.
He is now going to become the head of the music director of the New York Philharmonic, leaving an opening in Los Angeles, where you're from.
If you can make a phone call, then
yeah.
Maybe we'll be in business.
I know people.
I used to go to both the Los Angeles Phil all the time. I used to go to the Pacific Symphony all the time.
Yeah.
And actually, both of them are under searches for music directors. I miss Los Angeles quite a lot. I mean, of course, I love traveling and I love where I am and all these things. But of course, my whole family is in Los Angeles.
Okay, so let's start with the recording. And Judith, I want you to join this conversation, please. This was done in November 2020. I began this program, Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, in April of 2020. In November of 2020, certainly in New York, but also much of the world, we were in high pandemic. And when it seemed to relent slightly in the summer of 2020, it came roaring back in the fall. And companies were canceling their live performances. Most of my work was canceled in theaters and in universities around the world because it was so unpredictable. And yet, collectively, the orchestra, Judith, the producer, managed to make a recording with orchestral musicians of new music and little-known music that went on to great acclaim, and it was a successful album artistically, I will tell you, in addition to, I believe it's #1 on the Billboard charts, I read, and therefore it's a successful album commercially as well. Number one, how did you resolve to make a recording in the teeth of a pandemic? And number two, how did you do it?
Well, Mike has to start this because
okay.
I came into it. There were other people who had been approached to produce. And eventually I was connected up with Shauna Quill, the executive director of the orchestra. And some of the things that she had been told they had to do had nothing to do with recording classical music, really. So, but before all that happened, it was Mike had to make the decision. He's got all these kids who've auditioned, gotten into the orchestra. They aren't going to be playing in Carnegie Hall, which they normally would be doing. So what does he do?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, thank you for the wonderful setup. I mean, that's essentially correct. The world broke down in the beginning of March of 2020. And our first foray into, I guess, digital music making, which is a lot of what this is, was actually, we were not the first, but we were one of the very first orchestras or ensembles to make one of those distanced performance videos of the people playing in little boxes. And I think that ours was published on March 23rd or 27th or something, 2020. It was very early. And it went moderately viral, and it was very exciting. And shortly after that, it had become clear that not only were we not going to play in Carnegie Hall in May of 2020, we also weren't going to be coming back in the fall. And that's when I basically sat down with our team and I said, well, we can't do nothing. We all agreed we can't do nothing. We have to do something. What can we do that is still very rewarding musically for the musicians, that they can feel that they're getting, because a huge part of our mission is performance, but also education, right? We want them to come out of it feeling like they've really gained skills that they can use. And so I pitched recording. And we, as Judy said, we went through many different conversations about how can one do this? Because the way you ordinarily record an orchestra is the whole orchestra is in a room and you record. That obviously was impossible. And we had many, many conversations. And thankfully, we ended up being connected to Judith and ended up on the right course. But it went through many iterations because we in the early summer or the late spring of 2020, we still didn't really know what the fall was going to look like. And so, we continued to organize and reshape what this was. But it ended up being, and Judith, of course, can talk about the mechanics of how this ended up going. But together as a team, we decided that we would be able to, though it would be strange, we would be able to record the full orchestra if we organized it very smartly, if we broke the orchestra up into groups, and we used the technique of overdubbing, which may actually be a relatively common way of recording in some other genres of music, but not at all in classical. But together we came up with the method. Of course, it was executed brilliantly by Judith in the recording studio to bring it together. And it was a matter of training the musicians to know what they were going to do and how they were going to have to do it. And that probably sets Judith up perfectly to talk about, the actual sessions and how it ended up being. And later, of course, I can talk about how we chose the music, but.
Yes, that was one of my questions. But Judith, when you speak, please define overdubbing.
Okay, so I want to start at the click track. Two of these pieces were easier to do to click, which means you've got something you have one ear on of a headphone, and it has this going, and it has beep, dot, 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 beep, dot, 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 so you know where one is if it's in 4/4. So first, Mike made a click track for them for each piece. He started with Michelle Kahn playing the piano concerto in her home, and then the way she wanted it to go. And then he created a click track for the piano concerto and sent it to the kids. So now they have to learn one ear on, going like this, one ear off, so they, the other way around, one ear off so they can actually hear their instruments. But they have to learn, the first thing is to learn to play to click without concentrating on the click. And this is something that is a very marketable skill. In other words, you want to be on time, but you want to be paying more attention to the music that you're making. And
playing musically.
Yeah, to play musically, even though there's this thing in your brain, So, well, down the line, they also had to learn in the studio to listen to themselves, the rest of their colleagues, the click, watch Michael, because all this, people always talk about playing together when you're overdubbing, when one group is laid down and then the next group listens to what was already played and syncs with it. The syncing part is the easy part. The playing in tune with and syncing is the hard part. And so what we did was, as Michael said, he divided the strings into two sections.
Roughly 30 each, roughly 30 people each.
Which is this was done in the Domena Center. It's a big room, but it's not a very acoustically inviting room. Fortunately, the people who run the recording studio there can make it sound like Carnegie Hall. So, but they had measured out 6 feet and more distances between the musicians. Everybody's under headphones. There's a forest of mics, many of which weren't used, but they were there in case. The first take or two, the kids were still sort of learning how to do this, but boy did they learn fast. And they really learned that they're making music first and foremost. And it was lucky that we were doing it with the piano concerto first, because that meant that they were really making music and they were interacting with the piano. And I think that carried on into the other.
And just so I understand, Michelle Kahn, the pianist, was she in the studio too, or was her performance pre-recorded?
No,
she was there.
Okay.
Yeah, she and the strings were there at the same time.
Okay.
But I'll say, because it goes right along that we were very, almost all of the training of the musicians and preparing them for this happened outside of the studio. We had almost it really is amazing how well it came together, even considering, but almost all of the rehearsal for this took place over Zoom and over Google Drive, because this was pre-vaccine. So we knew that the more times that we met in person, the greater chance that there was going to be that somebody would get sick, which we didn't want, because we don't want people to get sick.
Yes.
We also knew that if people got sick, it could derail the whole project. And so almost all of the prep for this was done, as Judy said, of me creating the click tracks and having them play at home, practicing what it was going to be like, sending us recordings that we could give them feedback. So they arrived to that first day of recording having very little, only a couple hours of actual in-person thing. And the piano concerto, we actually didn't rehearse beforehand with Michelle. Our first day with her was the day that we recorded. It speaks to the fact that everybody was playing at their absolute top level. Michelle was, we were, the young musicians were, Judith was, everybody was at their top game, to the point where with no rehearsal, which was the only way that it could safely be done in November 2020, it came together the way that it came together.
Now, what Michael had done is divided the strings, as I said. The winds and percussion were going to have to be there separately. Wonderful thing happened the first day, which was we listened to the sound. Well, we had decided that the group that learned 2 of the pieces would overdub themselves. But as soon as we heard the sound that Isaiah, the engineer, got, we realized this we didn't have to overdub. The string sounded so good.
I'm going to ask you again to describe overdubbing. What is that?
Okay, so you have one track that has been pre-recorded, or the click track, or the click track, and then you play along and you have to react to it because it's not going to react to you.
Okay.
So
yeah, groups recording on top of each other.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's kind of like, I was once involved in a recording in which an artist was brought in at the last minute, replacing another artist, a singer. And the music had been recorded by Leonard Bernstein, actually, for the previous singer, and the expert artist who came in to replace that singer, such a good musician that she in her head could hear the recorded music for the previous artist, who had a very different voice, and sing to make herself sound great, but also so that Bernstein's music sounded great, with Bernstein standing right there conducting her while smoking a cigarette in a studio. I'm not kidding. And she did it in 2 takes, and then she said, "You have to get out because I can't breathe and sing with your cigarette smoke." But to me, that maybe this is an example of overdubbing, and that she took an existing recorded soundtrack for the artist who canceled, and she then came in and sang to that. Is that an example of overdubbing?
Yes.
Okay, good.
And it was necessary for this project only because we weren't able to get all 100 people in the room together. So it had to be done one group, and then another group, and then another group. It was the only way to do it, and that's why we needed a click track, because we had to record it the exact same way every time in order to make it work. And it's not the normal way of doing it, but it was the only way that it was possible for this time.
Michael Repper, you as the conductor, how do you conduct music for a recording when you, in effect, are doing it in components rather than having the whole orchestra in front of you? You have one group of strings, another group of strings, and then the instruments you blow into and the instruments you bang on.
Sure, it is a challenge. I guess the biggest challenge is conveying the context of the music. When we were recording Jesse Montgomery's Soul Force, and the strings, as Judith said, went first. The string sound in Soul Force, out of context of what the piece is almost unrecognizable, because this is a piece that has driving drum set and a groovy rhythm in the brass, and the strings are more or less playing whole notes a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. And so the challenge that was this album, just in general, was being able to convey that energy. And so, the actual mechanics of conducting, the mechanics of conducting and getting it to happen is maybe even easier in this method, because you don't have as big an orchestra, right? You can focus on a smaller group. But it's about trying to get the musicians to understand the music in general as they're playing. That is the chief challenge. But it went very well.
And they had never heard the music.
Right. Yeah. And they had never heard it because it hadn't been recorded before. So, what they had heard was, because I made the click tracks myself, when I made the click track, so this would have been back in, June or so of 2020, I also put together MIDI tracks of all of the pieces. And by MIDI, I went with my keyboard and I played all of the parts so that people could have an understanding of basically what this is. But it didn't sound, like the recording, but it gives people a basic idea. But that was part of, again, how do you bring this together? It was a matter of making sure that the strings in particular, because they went first, needed to have some kind of understanding of what the piece was before doing it, because they weren't going to be able to hear the winds and brass, and the strings didn't hear it until the album came out, or until shortly before it did.
So let's construct a timeline. If the recording was done in November 2020, and you were creating these individual pieces, let's call it, in June of 2020, when did you decide, number one, to do a recording? Number two, when was the music picked? And also, why was the music picked that you chose? It's excellent music, but it's also not music that immediately one would think of to record. There's a certain theme to the album of African-American female composers, but within that, there's a broad range of musical style and expression, and therefore it's not monolithic, thank goodness. It's diverse and fascinating. But we need to know the timeline, how you got to November and how everybody was prepared, and at what point Judith and her team came in.
Yeah, absolutely. I can take you all through it. So like I said, the pandemic started. And it became clear in maybe mid to late April that we weren't going to be performing in May, also not in the fall. So we decided to make the recording. And it so happens that we were supposed to give the Carnegie Hall premiere of Florence Price's Piano Concerto, which was on this album, with Michelle Kahn. at Carnegie Hall in May of 2020 on that canceled concert. And that had been planned a year and a half, 2 years earlier. But that concert was canceled. And so we had been really looking forward to playing that piece because it's an amazing piece. We had been looking forward to working with Michelle. So once we decided to make the album, that was the first thing that went on the album. That was the first thing I said, well, we were going to perform this. It's an important piece. It really ought to be recorded. Also, it had never before been performed or recorded in the composer's original orchestration.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't know if you know the story, but somebody bought a house, a summer home outside of Chicago, which turned out to be Florence Price's former, summer home or home. And in the attic were all these scores of hers, which were newly discovered because these people went up into their attic. And the piano concerto, as it had been known, was about 8 minutes long. It had been way cut down to under half. And so now, complete piano concerto, yeah, this is a world premiere because it's finally, the whole piano concerto is back together again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we had been supposed to give the Carnegie Hall premiere of that piece, and it got canceled. So that went on the album. That was number one. And Michelle, was absolutely game to do this. And thank goodness. And of course, she performs it so well on the album. And then I started to think about, okay, what else are we going to perform? And I was thinking musically, what is very important. And I was thinking, we're all at home. We're all in our own little areas. We're trying to not see each other. We're all separated. And what we're craving more than anything else is some semblance of unity, whatever that could be for 2020. And so I knew that, of course, I'd known Valerie Coleman's Umoja in, the wind quintet version, the choral, and other sorts of things. But I knew that Valerie had written.
And just to define, Umoja is one of the 7 principles of Kwanzaa. It's the first one, meaning unity.
It means unity. Yeah, I was just about to say that. Yeah, so
which is important in the context of what you're talking about.
Exactly right. Yeah. So Umoja means unity, and so I knew that she had written a full orchestra arrangement of her tune Umoja for the Philadelphia Orchestra, which they had played in 2019, but which had never been recorded or hadn't yet been recorded. And Umoja meaning unity. In fact, the full title of the piece is Umoja, Anthem of Unity. I thought, perfect. This is exactly what, and the music itself is exactly the right challenge for youth orchestra, for a very good youth orchestra nonetheless, but provides exactly the right kinds of musical challenges that we're looking for. And so that piece was chosen because of the meaning of what the music is. And so we had 2 works on the album at that point. And then it was just around the same time that George Floyd was murdered. And it seemed that it was incredibly important. Well, it's always important, but especially in that time, to
just context for people listening elsewhere in the world. George Floyd was an African-American man who was murdered by 4 police, especially 1 police officer, but 3 others did nothing in Minnesota. A very brave 17-year-old woman.
Fred, you just...
I don't know if Fred dropped out.
Did I drop out? Okay.
Oh, you're back now.
I'll repeat what I was saying. Okay, I was saying that George Floyd was murdered in late May of 2020 by a police officer in Minneapolis.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, you froze again. And yeah, so
well anyway, I can continue that the idea behind choosing Ethiopia's Shadow in America and in choosing Soul Force is that these are both works that address systemic issues and systemic racism from the point of view of Black women, which is important always, but was particularly important, I think, in the middle of 2020 when we were choosing the works. And so that's how the 4 pieces ended up coming together. So Judith, I was going to say
was that Jesse Montgomery had once been a violinist in
Right.
the Youth Symphony.
And what's crazy about that, and Jesse Montgomery being an alum, is, and this is maybe a little embarrassing for me, but I actually didn't know when I chose the music. It wasn't until after I chose Soul Force that somebody said, "Do you know that Jesse used to be a violinist in the orchestra?" I said, "Oh my gosh, what serendipity!" And so it all, it all came together exactly like that, and it was musical. I'm curious, Judith, while we're waiting.
Well, I just want to say one other thing: that Jesse Montgomery is now the composer in residence at the Chicago Symphony. So,
right,
and this happened. She wasn't when this album was made, and then suddenly there she is.
Right, exactly. While we're waiting for Fred, I'm curious to hear what was your favorite part of this process, because I know that the way we went about this recording was not usual. And you're not typically working with teenagers. I'm curious, what was your favorite part about this?
Well, first of all, I didn't think of them as teenagers because they were so focused and they were so good. I mean, they were just a group of musicians I was working with. Age was a barrier or anything, but I just want to say the thing that we skipped was that at the end of the days of the string sessions, I'd have to knock together something like an edit. It certainly, it wasn't going to be the final edit, but we had to send things to the winds because, as I said before, what the tough thing is getting in tune. And the winds had to hear not just the shape of the piece, but what the intonation was, and have as much time with the work as possible. So, each day they would get a new set of
and those were put together extremely quickly because our recording sessions, if I remember right, were essentially 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. or something like that. And so between
days, the string days weren't that long.
Oh, they weren't quite that long. Well, anyway, I seem to remember that it was, it was a huge lift, to put together those edits, what you're talking about, because the woodwinds needed something to be able to play against. But that's when I started to get very excited. I started to get very excited because the impetus behind doing this project was, first and foremost, we wanted to provide an educational experience to the kids, right? And to a certain extent, and I'm speaking just for myself here, I don't want to speak for you, but I don't know that any of us really knew what we were going to get necessarily when we got in there. We wanted it to be extremely good, but this was all, I don't want to say experimental, but this was not, we were going to find out when we got into the room what we were going to have. And I started to get very excited on that first day, when I heard in the studio, but also when I started to hear those edit reference points that you put together, I was like, wow, this is going to be very good. This isn't even edited yet. That was when I started to get excited. And I'm curious to know, and I had the privilege of working with you in the mixing room, but I'm curious to know what went into what,
Hi.
Oh, hello, you're back.
Okay, so the last thing that we were talking about was George Floyd and the importance of the music and the context. I don't want to lose the thread of what we're talking about. And by the way, I find it ironic that we're talking about technology. I have an old motto: live by technology, die by technology. I'm very artisanal in my work in most cases, but pick up, Michael, where you were.
No, and I'll say we did finish the thought, and I discussed how the rest of the album was chosen. So I think all the listeners got the idea. I was just about to ask Judith.
Okay, but I would love to know briefly what you said because I can't ask you a question.
Sure. No, so we had chosen Umoja, and then it was, I said, right around the time that George Floyd was murdered, and we concluded explaining that, and I decided that it was incredible. Well, it's always important. I said it's always important, but it was particularly important in that moment to center the works of music that address systemic problems and systemic racism, and particularly those that come from the points of view of Black women. And so that's how Ethiopia's Shadow in America got chosen, and that's how Soul Force got chosen. And it ended up being an incredibly cohesive.
I want to talk to you a bit about Ethiopia because it's a fascinating piece to me.
It is an amazing piece.
I don't know if you know my background, that much of my work is centered on Italy. So therefore, Ethiopia, in the Italian context, because Mussolini invaded in 1936, and Haile Selassie of Ethiopia came to represent a lot more than just defiance of Mussolini, but he represented a whole continent in terms of Black independence and self-reliance. Ethiopia being an ancient culture, one of the oldest in the world. It's also where coffee is from, so it's a sacred place to me. And it's Ethiopia for African Americans came to symbolize Africa in a major way. For Jamaicans, in particular, their whole religious practice is based on Ethiopian beliefs, yes. Something not everybody knows. So therefore, the word Ethiopia means not just the nation in East Africa where Addis Ababa is the capital, but a whole imagery of Black identity. Also, you triggered, Michael, something that I wanted to say. April 24th of 2020, that was the day of my first show, but it brought back something in my mind. I was supposed to be in Chicago that day speaking for the Chicago Symphony about Florence Price, because Riccardo Muti was going to conduct one of her symphonies. I was there. I was to be there for Wagner's Ring Cycle. That was my main job. But the Friday night was between Siegfried and Götterdämmerung, and I booked a speech about Florence Price. So I had done a great deal of preparation about her in her town and about what Judith was talking about, the finding of all of these scores. And she thankfully is finally getting some of the attention that she deserves, but there's a long way to go. And she's, I don't want to think people to think there's one African-American composer we don't know. There are many, many, not only in the past, but right now. Last night at Carnegie Hall, the tenor Lawrence Brownlee gave a performance of music that was about rising up from the pandemic. And there were 5 Black composers there who he commissioned to do new works for the concert. It was just wonderful to see 5 composers who wrote beautiful, inspiring music being there. And as Larry said, this is not necessarily Black music. It's music by Black composers, but it speaks to the human condition and all of us, and should not be marginalized to just being Black music, although the artists who created it are wonderful Black people. So
that's right, and as proud as we are, of course, of having recorded an album that does feature works that are written entirely by Black women, it was really approached first and foremost from the music side. And I think that the composers would want their music to be known for being great music first and foremost. And I'm very proud musically of how the orchestra played, and particularly considering the circumstances of how we had to do it. Yeah.
So now I'm turning to Judith. Judith, before this album with its special circumstances, you have produced many, many recordings, award-winning recordings of great quality. I've never asked a producer, what does a producer of a musical recording do? I've worked with them, but they don't talk about what they're doing, they just do it. What is your job?
Okay, my job is from some phone call or text or email that says, thus and such people want to do thus and such repertoire. And everything from there to delivering a master is up to me. So it may include finding a venue. Sometimes I'm also the engineer, so my assistant and I lug our equipment to a hall, build a recording studio, get a sound in agreement with the musicians. Then the first big part of being a producer is running the session, which is a kind of push and pull. The better I know the musicians, the better I can be with them. I can say, I know you're not going to like such and such. You're going to come back to me and say, that's too loud, or that, where's the pianissimo, or, or I know what they like and what they don't. So running the session, this generally means what will happen is we'll do a take one, and they will listen to it, pick at it, go back and probably do take two and maybe take three, complete movements or whatever. And then if it's a big movement, we'll probably divide it into big chunks and cover everything. And if it gets down to a little something that, you never got to letter A together, let's just get that together. Then I listen through everything again. I mark a score, and that means I put a line, okay, from on one side, we're going to go from take three to take two. And it's not, I'm looking for good, better, and best. I'm looking for what moves me. Take three might just continue, be fine, but there's something about take two that I'm not going to leave, as I say, on the cutting room floor. So I mark it all. My assistant goes in, puts it into the editor, lines it up for me. I go in and edit it. Maybe change my mind about things as I listen through it. Send it to the musicians, first edit, and they make comments. Did I ever do thus and such? Is there a bigger crescendo? Is there a better accelerando? Is there some, all these musical things. And then I go and find out whether there was a bigger crescendo or there was a better accelerando, and send it back to them. They'll send back a few comments. Sometimes it's go back to take one. And then, well, in the case of this album, because the orchestra was not together, we had to do a mix. And we went to Kilgore Sound, John Kilgore's studio, because, the winds couldn't figure out how to balance to the strings because they couldn't hear them other than this little teeny. So Michael and I went to John's studio and mixed, and I think it was occurring to both of us at that point that this was something really special when everything was coming together. And you heard, how can I say this? You heard the light in their eyes. You heard that these were really committed performances, and that it was at the mix that we finally realized that this was even better than what we thought at the recording sessions.
So Judith, when you are the producer of an album, let's not take this one with the special circumstances, but a pre-pandemic album, who has the final say as to when you in effect put it to bed? Is it the producer? Is it the conductor or soloist?
It's always the musicians.
Okay.
It's their record. It's not my record. Okay. My name is on the back of the record. Theirs is on the front. It's their call. I mean, I have put out things that I disagree with, but it's not, I think, it's rare. It's very rare, but no, it's for the musicians.
I think it's a similar relationship to, I was going to say, I think it's a similar relationship to the way that a conductor ought to be with a soloist, in the same way. If you're doing a live performance with a soloist, the soloist is giving their performance, and you support their artistic vision.
So, in other words, the famous contretemps between Leonard Bernstein and Glenn Gould about how a concerto should be played, where they both addressed the audience in New York and explained their different visions of the music. Judith, another question that I have carried for 50 years. I work in opera. I hear great, great voices all the time. There are some voices that are magnificent in the theater, Eva Martone, Birgit Nilsson, that don't necessarily record that well. And I would argue that maybe it was the time when Nilsson sang, but Martone sang later on. I've never heard a recording that captures the magnificence of their sound, whereas other singers sound okay in the theater, but sound glorious on recording. And then there are people like Leontine Price who sound gorgeous in the theater and gorgeous on recording. How do you record a voice? And what do you do if you discover that maybe this fantastic artist does not record well?
I don't believe that there's nobody who can't record well.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, it's the choice of microphones and the position of them. And if you're too close to the singer, the voice becomes small. And of course, the room that the person is singing in is 50% of the problem. A big voice without how can I put this? A big voice in a room that does not answer the singer will start forcing, and then nothing will sound great. And so finding the right venue and, making choices. And, with things like that, I will go out into the hall and then run back into the studio, out into the hall, and it's a game of inches. I can move a microphone 2 inches and everything gets better or gets worse or whatever. But it really has much more with voices. You have to get out into the halls, see what's out there, and try to capture it. And that's the thing with classical music. I mean, with a lot of pop music, they're creating the image and the whatever. Much more with classical engineering, you're trying to capture something. And
also, because we should make this clear to listeners, although we all know this, that in almost every circumstance in opera and classical music, they are not being amplified with microphones. They're natural sound. Whereas the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger is a terrific singer, I think, and Roger Daltrey and the Who, they're great singers, but they use the microphone as part of their musical communication.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, the microphone changed music. I think it was actually Bing Crosby who realized came the microphone that he was going to have a career.
Mm-hmm.
Because he was not going to be able to project like an opera singer. And so crooning became the thing.
A different style.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole thorny issue of live performances that are recorded. And there are two of these. One is where it's official. There was a Tristan and Isolde with Placido Domingo and Nina Stemma years ago that was recorded in live performance very well. But then there are what used to be called the pirate recordings, in which somebody would come into the theater and have a little or not so little tape recorder on his lap or in his lapel, or there was someone in the Metropolitan Opera who used to record a lot of things illegally and would share them around. And these were not necessarily faithful sonically, but they captured moments in live performance that could often be thrilling. I think of an artist who I love, Leonie Rieseneck, who was absolutely thrilling on the stage. She was not always note perfect, but capturing her live created a sensation that very few recordings could ever do. And
well, these days, almost all opera recordings are live. There are no, but it's much too expensive now to do a quote studio recording of an opera. So, I do think the presence of an audience creates a sense of communication between the singer has a better sense of communication than when there's no one there. But I have to tell you, if you can find this video, I wish I still had the link to it. The Schulte Ring. And
Oh, yeah.
there is Nielsen on stage. The orchestra's down on the floor. She is about 12 feet from this huge microphone. And there's a guy standing next to her. So she's there with her stand. And she's got a very high note coming up. And she starts backing up away from the mic. And the guy picks up the stand, comes with her. She sings her big high note and then goes back to her original position. And
I know that recording well. Then there's a related one. I don't know if you know this one. When Brunhilde, Birgit Nielsen, in the famous Schulte Ring, sings Starke Scheide, in other words, the immolation scene at the end, she's supposed to grab her horse Grane. And the Viennese can be funny. And someone brought a horse into the recording studio. And there's a video of this, and places the tether of the horse in the hand of Birgit Nielsen, who's simultaneously singing this fantastic music and trying not to laugh as the horse's ears are rearing back at the sound of Birgit Nielsen. So they had to break that rehearsal. We saw George Schulte laugh. It was, I think they felt at that moment, after recording an entire Ring cycle, the tension had to be broken before they proceeded to do this. And people can find that on YouTube. But I want to get back to the concept of pirates just a little bit. Jesse Norman, who I knew and worked with a fair amount, tried to banish all pirate recordings of her because she felt, number one, that it was not capturing her to her approval, but number two, she was not making money on that. And she had a point. But I don't know, I also am someone who treasures hearing performances that people captured when the artist was not aware that she was being recorded, because of the freedom of the spontaneity. And the audience is a big part of it. Judith, when you record a live symphonic or opera performance with an audience, do you include applause in the final recording, or how is that decided?
Yeah. And sometimes the non-awful coughs. Most live recordings, there'll be a rehearsal that'll be recorded that one can use when somebody has a complete coughing fit in the middle of some dreamy section. But yes, the audience was there. The audience has to have its say, and it's not interesting audio, so I don't think it should go on very long.
There's one recording of a live performance at the Carnegie Hall with the Opera Orchestra of New York, with Eve Queller conducting Gabriela Benashkova and Leonie Rieseneck in Jenova by Janacek. And the famous second act scene in which basically the stepmother, played by Rieseneck, throws a fit, the applause went on through the entire intermission. And they had curtain calls during the intermission until Rieseneck basically said, I have to go to the restroom before I come back to sing Act 3. They recorded all of the applause. They recorded 20 minutes of applause. And there are versions of this in which you can hear all 20 minutes of applause and the surge of the crowd as she came back out again, and the cheers again, and then went off, the audience calling for more. And it's a different kind of document. It's not a musical document, but it's a document of an historic occasion.
That would happen in opera.
Well,
yeah,
and they also recorded clapping music, so that one was also.
I was singing with Steve Reich in the early 70s with Steve Reich's ensemble, and we were in Europe, and we were in Brussels of all places, and we're taken to a flamenco performance. And Steve saw this hocketing clapping and stuff, and 3 months later there was clapping music.
Michael, you were about to, I was going to use the word transition. That's a loaded word nowadays. What I mean is you were about to move on to another phase in your career. If I'm correct, May 28th is your last performance with the New York Youth Symphony. It will be at Carnegie Hall.
That's right.
What will be on the program, and then what will you be doing after that?
Wonderful. Yeah, it is. This is my 6th year with New York Youth Symphony and my final season with the group. It's been an unreal 6 years, and if you had asked me 7 years ago, I don't know that anybody could have predicted that my tenure would end with the Grammy Award. So it is thrilling, and a real testament to what all of us have built together. So I'm very, very proud of it. That concert on May 28th, which is at 2 p.m. at Carnegie Hall, we'll have a world premiere by a phenomenal young composer, Sophia Rocha. And then we're going to do Leonard Bernstein's Chichester Psalms. And yes, so one of my favorites. And well, if you liked that, and then in the second half, we'll do Mahler 1. So it's going to be a really tremendous concert. And we begin working on it in 2 days. And I know that the orchestra is very, very excited, and it's going to be great. And I've just taken 2 new music directorships, one in Ashland, Ohio with the Ashland Symphony, and another with the Mid-Atlantic Symphony in Maryland and Delaware. In fact, I've had those jobs now for this season as well. So I've already started there. And I've been working with professional orchestras alongside the New York Youth Symphony for the entire 6 years that I've been there. And I'm, still on the guest conductor circuit as well, and traveling the world and getting to work with some, tremendous ensembles. And so this has been a thrilling experience to work with New York Youth Symphony. I've been made a better musician for it. I think also, working with, no matter what I'm doing in my whole life, I will always work with young people. And my career and who I am as a person has been made because there were people who looked out for me when I was a teenager and even younger.
Talk a bit about Maren Alsop. Maren was my guest last year on this program.
Oh, fantastic.
And she's highly influential, not only as a great conductor, but as a mentor.
That's
Talk
right.
about that.
Look, I through a pretty crazy story, which I won't take I won't bore you with. But I was able to meet her when she was conducting Bernstein's Mass at the Hollywood Bowl, and I was 13. And because I had met a friend of hers who then had said to Maren, there's this 13-year-old kid who wants to be a conductor, and Maren being Maren and being very, very giving and wanting to support young people, because Leonard Bernstein supported her when she was young. Now she pays it forward to others. She brought me into her dressing room. We talked. She invited me to her conducting workshop in Santa Cruz. Then she invited me to study with her privately, which I did for many years. Moved to Baltimore so that I could study at the Peabody Institute, and was the conducting fellow of the Baltimore Symphony for a couple of years. And I believe that Maren was the person who floated my name when, for people who they should audition for the New York Youth Symphony job. Maren, has been very, very influential to me, not just in teaching me about, conducting, the technical aspects of conducting, and has made me a good conductor because of working with her on the technique side. But I think that Maren demonstrates just as much as anybody else, if not more than anybody else, I think the true essence of what conducting is, and really taught me what conducting is, which is that fundamentally it's about connecting people. We were just talking about connecting the audience to the orchestra, and the orchestra with themselves, which was the whole essence of how we made this project happen. How we make orchestras as organizations true members of their community is actually the majority of the job of what makes a good conductor a good conductor. Of course, you build everything on the bedrock of having the highest possible level artistic performance, right? That's the bedrock, but that's also like a basic job requirement. And then, to have the top level music performance, there's so much more on top of that. And Maren demonstrates that, and she teaches it to her students, myself included. And that's because she was taught that by her mentors, chief among them, Leonard Bernstein. Yeah. Exactly. And so she's been incredibly influential for me. And so that's when I say, why I say, I'll always work with young people. No matter what I'm doing, that's, in paying it forward. So just because I'm ending with New York Youth Symphony doesn't mean that I'll stop looking for ways to give back to young people. And that is the case also at my professional orchestras. We've got great amazing programs already, both at the Ashland Symphony and at the Mid-Atlantic Symphony, that are interacting directly with young people in the community. And that's just critically important.
And Judith, in your legendary 15 Grammy Award, multi-decade series of achievements, is there a recording or a music or a musician that you've not yet done or worked with that you want to?
Well, there must be, but I can't think of one.
Okay. But any piece of music that you've never worked on as a producer that you would like the challenge of working on?
Oh boy. I would like to re-record the Elliott Carter.
I'm taking notes. I'm taking notes here. I'm trying to.
Elliott Carter's Syrinx. It's not an orchestral piece. I draw a blank. Just
okay.
I'm sure that there, you know, that 10 years ago I would have come up with a list, you know.
Well, just one more question with this, because we're approaching the 150th birthday of Rachmaninoff. So I'm thinking bells and organs and so on. Is it hard to record an organ or bells or gongs and that kind of percussion as opposed to strings and winds and brass?
Oh, an organ is a nightmare. Again, you're up again. What you need is the acoustic, right?
Yeah.
So, and you need to have the right balance between the acoustic and the organ. And of course, the organ's up in a loft. Can you imagine what kind of mic stands you have?
Mm-hmm.
You can't put them up in the loft with them. You know,
yeah.
Close. But also, the organ has a much wider range of frequencies than even a symphony orchestra. So you've got to get that 32 foot.
Yeah.
And you've got to get that flute stop. And of course you want an organist who really knows how to register the thing. Yeah, it can be set it up and it works, or it can be, you know, an hour sound check while you move 1 inch here and 1 inch there. Percussion is not so hard.
Okay.
And you know, any metal percussion. Okay, next time you go to an orchestra concert, close your eyes and think of where the instruments are, and you will think that the triangle is in front of the conductor. Those metal things, and that's the way the microphones hear it too. When I recorded the Cincinnati Orchestra, I sometimes had to open the shell in the back, put the triangle just outside, you know, still so you could see the conductor, but you know, it would sound like it was in your lap, in spite of the fact that it was at the back of a very large orchestra. I mean, you have to have the right microphones there because the attacks have to come back straight up. And if you have a microphone that rolls things off, not going to work. I mean, you really need those attacks. And there are very few microphones that can handle that.
Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to close my eyes at concerts. Recently, I went to hear a performance of the New York Philharmonic and I shut my eyes. It was a beautiful lyrical section by Mahler, and I shut my eyes, and out on Twitter went the message, Fred Plotkin is sleeping at the New York Philharmonic performance. So I have to always, you know, look engaged because I get recognized. And it's a problem. I'm not allowed to even shut my eyes to meditatively hear without looking at the music being made. My congratulations to both of you, and to, by extension, all the musicians involved in this project. the New York Youth Symphony, the Grammy-winning recording with Michael Repper conducting the New York Youth Symphony, Judith Sherman producing it, winning her 15th classical Grammy. I was really honored to have both of you on to explore the process of what you do, which is fascinating anyway, but under the circumstances of a pandemic is really a gift to music. And I thank both of you and keep up the good work. And I will see you around town, I hope.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. Be well.